he's taking a category, fasting, identifying with people to show compassion, something this guy really values, and showing actually that's what God does, even more so and in spades. You think that thing is really good? Well, God does it even more. Do you want to find out more about him? And at the end of the bus journey, the guy didn't say, "Good sir, what must I do to be saved?" But you hope it's put a stone in his shoe, got him thinking about these things, and that's what we do in our conversations with people. Possibly a bit like Paul in Athens when he used the poets in that way. Your poets have said a few true things, but let me tell you more about who God really is. So 5 pillars, 6 beliefs, but what about things that Muslim people object to? There are 4 key objections that every Muslim person I've met in this country or in Bangladesh has had against my faith. That Jesus is not the Son of God, he's not divine, the Trinity is just plain wrong, that Jesus didn't die, and the Bible's been changed. Now, those first 3 are in the Quran. The Quran says that Jesus is not the Son, that you shouldn't say 3, the Trinity, and that Jesus wasn't crucified. But the 4th one isn't actually in the Quran, and often some Muslim people, like the teacher there, are willing to say it is the Word of God. But as they hear Christians say from the Bible that Jesus is the Son, that he died and the Trinity is true, they will come to the conclusion the Bible has been corrupted in some way. It's been changed. But the Quran is clear that it confirms the previous scriptures. And the Quran is clear that Allah doesn't allow his word to be changed. So actually it seems really that when the Quran does talk about the scriptures or the people who use the scriptures in a negative way, it's not saying the text has been changed, but people's interpretation is wrong about it. But it's great, like when that teacher says this is God's word, you hope that will encourage the children to take it seriously and not to believe things they've heard elsewhere. Before that book that Mark advertised, I wrote another book called Dear Abdullah, which deals with some of these objections, which you might find helpful. So, 5 pillars, 6 beliefs, 4 objections. But again, there's much more to Islam than this. And here are a few more things as to what is important in most Muslim people's life. I'd say Muhammad or the Hadith are of supreme importance. The Hadith is the kind of written sayings of Muhammad based on some biographies of him as well. Muslim people are to emulate Muhammad. He is the best example they are to follow. That Surah 33 says. Imam Malik, who founded one of the schools of Sharia, he wrote in this book called Al-Muwatta, which kind of is a legal book. He said this: "The Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, I've left 2 matters with you. As long as you hold to them, you will not go the wrong way. They're the book of Allah, the Quran, and the Sunnah, or the way of his prophet." From where we get the word Sunni, they are following the way of Muhammad. And that particular bit in quotes is from one hadith collection put together by a guy called Bukhari, who was from Bukhara in Uzbekistan. And he's got the word Sahih before his name there in the brackets, because that means sound or authentic. He's collected 7,000 authentic sayings about Muhammad, and you've got them here. And he lived there. I've put some dates for you: 163 to 203 AH. That's not a typo. It shouldn't be AD. It's after Hijrah. Hijrah is the time when the Islamic calendar begins, the dates when Muhammad and the Muslims migrate from Mecca to Medina, around 620-ish. So Bukhari has recorded these sayings of Muhammad about 150, 200 years after Muhammad. I've put some dates there in AD. 610 is when Muhammad is said to have received his first revelations. 622, when he went to Medina. 632, when he's thought to have died. A lot of that chronology is contested by historians, and if you want to read more about that, look at Tom Holland's recent-ish book, In the Shadow of the Sword. But religiously, kind of personally, the Hadith and Muhammad become the interpretive key for Muslim people to understand the Quran and all of life, really. The Hadith and Muhammad provide more detail about how you should live for God. So the Quran says you should take time out in your day to pray, to submit, but the Quran doesn't give you all 5 times. It gives you some of them, but not all 5. But the Hadith gives you all 5 times of the day. It gives you more detail. It also provides more fear at times. For example, there's a Hadith that says the majority of the inhabitants of hell are women who've been ungrateful to their husbands. It can also provide more comfort, though, as it says things like, if you go to mosque on a Friday and do it all properly, you'll be washed clean. Or if you go on pilgrimage, you'll come back like a newborn baby. Reading the Hadith and following Muhammad can make people seem more fundamentalist, more like Muhammad in everything that he did. The Quran says that Muslim people should enjoin what is right and forbid what is evil. Another quote for you from another collection of Hadith. Whoever amongst you sees an evil, he must change it with his hand. If he's unable to do so, then with his tongue. And if he's unable to do so, then with his heart. And that is the weakest form of faith. And then one scholar, Taymiyyah, a medieval scholar who Bin Laden and others like him looked to, said this: the duty of commanding the good and forbidding the evil cannot be completely discharged without power and authority. And this is what maybe some of our students see in Islamic societies at universities. They are often seen to be more fundamentalist, kind of in your face, wanting to follow Muhammad. It might be more under the surface, but often, certainly in London, where the Islamic societies are enormous compared to the Christian unions, this is often what they are like. Or it can lead to another kind of type of Islam, may lead to a more woolly Islam. And I mean that in two ways. Woolly in terms of kind of being a bit more liberal, a bit less rooted in the Quran. But also the first people to follow this kind of Islam are called Sufis. And the word Suf, it comes from the word meaning wool. And so they're actually wearing wool, is what's going on there as well. But for these guys, Muhammad is the perfect man. He's the perfect example and a perfect mediator. You don't pray to him now, as Roman Catholic people might pray to Mary or saints, but the hope is that on the last day, he will be a mediator for you, an intercessor for you. And there are some amazing poems about how wonderful and beautiful Muhammad is and how he will intercede for you. And many, many Muslim people recite those. But these kind of Muslim people will emphasize an inner dimension, that your heart before God is really important, and you can come close to God through meditation, or particularly needing a guide, someone that is closer to you, closer to God than you are, who is following someone who's following someone who's following someone, a bit like saints in Roman Catholicism again. But if you follow this particular saint's guidance, you might become more holy like him. Holiness is kind of hierarchical in that way. And this might be what you find when you dig a bit deeper in your Muslim friends' faith. They might not want to talk about these kind of things so much, or they might. But it might be that they really hope that Muhammad is going to intercede for them, and that they follow a particular, to kind of mix religious metaphors, a particular kind of guru that will help them get closer to God and closer to Muhammad. You've got a picture on the top there, that's Ayatollah Khomeini. So he was seen as a fundamentalist, even though he was Shiite. And then below him is Sheikh Murad, who is Timothy Winter, is his English name, brother of Henry Winter, the Telegraph and Times sports journalist. And he is a lecturer in an Islamic college in Cambridge. And he says that if all Muslims were Sufis, emphasizing this inner dimension, then all people would be Muslims. He's so convinced this is the right way and is so attractive. And often, these kind of Muslim people are putting on events for non-Muslims to come to, where you might see them chanting or dancing. Whirling dervishes, that's an example of this kind of meditative dance. And will often provide food. One Christian friend I was talking to said that the Sufi mosque near him, they were providing meals on Christmas Day for people who were lonely. And it's not just, and it was all kinds of people Sufi Muslim people were there. Not just old guys, but women, young men doing this kind of thing. But for all of these different kinds of people, Muhammad is very important for them. What else is important? Well, spiritual forces. As Christian people, we believe in spiritual forces. But living in the West, we often don't believe them that much. But for most Muslim people, they will believe them, that there's this kind of middle area between God and me. God is so distant. I am here. What influences what happens to me here? Well, the spiritual forces, spirits, what they often call jinn, where we get our word genie from. Some of these jinn are good and some of them are bad. They might talk about them as ghosts. One friend talks about them as ghosts. She said her house in one corner, there's a ghost. She's kind of using English words to explain that there's this jinn there that they are fearful of. And that may lead to a more kind of superstitious, traditional, folky form of Islam, where people rely on amulets or charms to keep them safe. 20 years ago, in Tower Hamlets, almost all the babies born to Bangladeshi parents would have a page of the Quran written really, really small and then folded up and put in a little box and tied to the baby's arm or possibly around their neck to protect them, or would have a kind of a splodge put on their forehead to make them look less attractive and so people wouldn't be jealous of them and cause an envious spirit to be created over the baby. One family that we used to help the children with their schoolwork, and the mother grew coriander for her husband's curry house, and the coriander grew really well. One year, that was fine. The next year it grew really well, but then a neighbor came round and said, "Oh, your coriander's lovely." And the next week it all died. And the Bangladeshi lady said, "It's because that neighbor was jealous and she put the evil eye on my coriander." Now, it might well have been a slug or a snail that ate the coriander, but she'd still say it was that neighbor's jealousy, her envy, that created the evil spirit. Now, as a Western materialist, rationalist person, I can say, what nonsense. Or I can say as a Christian, yeah, evil spirits are real. I don't know what happened to your coriander, but I don't need to fear those things. Not because of who I am, but because of who Jesus is. And we had a conversation about Jesus driving out the demons, Legion, in Mark 4 and 5. Again, it's just an opportunity to talk about Jesus and why, and the difference that he's made to our lives. Just top of the next page, top of page 4, one book by a former bishop in Egypt and missionary, Bill Musk, called The Unseen Face of Islam. Gives more information on this kind of stuff. And then third thing that's really important, I think group orientation is probably the most important part of the worldview, as it is for many non-Western people, regardless of their religion. But in some sense, I think it's being challenged here. I think certainly younger people are being taught to think for themselves and not just to go along with what their group think. But there's still an element of, as the next bullet point says, I belong, therefore I am. That's what makes me who I am, rather than a more Western worldview, I think, therefore I am. What I do, if I'm part of a belong, therefore I am idea, what I do impacts the whole group. My behavior can make the group look good or look bad, which is why we have things called honor killings, or rather it should be called shame killings. Someone has brought shame on the family, and that shame needs to be got rid of. And the best way of getting rid of shame is through exclusion or death, sadly. But shame and honor become very important things. And the Bible is full of shame and honor, isn't it? Genesis 3, as Adam and Eve turn away from God, they are fearful, they hide, they are guilty, but they are ashamed. They try and cover themselves. Jesus took our shame when he died on the cross. And we can talk about shame and honor, and that group is important. Sometimes we can think that the individual is more important than the group. Not just, I think, therefore I am. I'm a freestanding person, but I am on my own before God. I will stand before him on my own on Judgment Day. And that's true, and every Muslim person would agree with that as well. But groups are really important as well in Scripture. God deals with Israel as a collective often. When one person sins, Achan, a collective group is said to have sinned. When David sins, all of Israel is punished. One person's behavior impacts the whole group. Adam's behavior has impacted us as a group, which again leads to Jesus. Who your head is really important. Is Adam your head in Romans 5, leading to sin and death? Or is Jesus your head, leading to life and righteousness? And we can talk in these kind of categories, which sometimes more Western-oriented people don't always understand, but certainly Muslim people understand that the head of your group is really important and has an impact on who you are, and who you're connected with is really important. And that might impact how we do evangelism and discipleship. One-to-one Bible studies are great, but that might not be the best thing to do with some people. A group study might be better for some people than a one-to-one, partly because they might be fearful of speaking on their own. I've often found, bizarrely, a group of Muslim people much better than a one-to-one for people being open, which you wouldn't think is the case. But the one-to-one, I think the person treats me like a teacher and so won't open up, whereas in the group, they kind of feed off each other much more, which is interesting. So, some things that I think are really key for most Muslim people. But let's have some Bible, because we need to do that anyway, and I think this is really helpful. If you've got a Bible there, either paper or you turn it on your phone, we're going to spend a few minutes in Luke 9 before a break. Luke 9, as you're turning it up, Jesus begins by sending out the 12 apostles, and he gives them power to do the kinds of things he's doing. Amazing. And that's what causes Herod to start thinking, who is this guy that can do that? Who can give away power like that? Is he some prophet come back from the dead? Jesus then feeds 5,000 men, many more women and children, probably present. He's doing the kind of miracle that happened in Moses' day. Is he Moses? Who knows? Then Jesus asks Peter, who am I? And there's a declaration, you are the Christ of God. Jesus then says something about his death, and then we move to transfiguration, verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up on a mountainside to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. He didn't know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, This is my son, whom I've chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. So Jesus is up on this mountain, blazing glory, and speaks with Moses and Elijah about his departure, which in the Greek is Exodus, apparently. So Jesus is going on his Exodus. He's talking with them about this, his rescue mission. Who's left at the end? Well, Moses and Elijah aren't there anymore. Jesus is on the mountain alone. And part of that, I think, is to show that he is greater than both of those great Old Testament prophets. Moses brought the law on another mountain, Mount Sinai. Elijah enforced the law on another mountain, Mount Carmel, with the prophets of Baal. But Jesus is greater than both of those law bringers and law enforcers as he heads to his Exodus, this rescue mission. And we see he's greater because he's God's son, the chosen one who must be listened to. Jesus is better than a prophet because he's God's son. He's better than any ambassador. He's the kind of the queen's son who can speak on her behalf, much better than any ambassador. Jesus is like that, better than any prophet. He's the complete mediator who should be listened to. He not only speaks God's words, but goes on a rescue mission to rescue God's people. We need no one else and nothing more. I know we know that, but I think it's a good reminder. Because Islam takes this apart. In Islam, the prophets are relativized. They're all said to be relatively equal. Jesus, Moses, Elijah, John the Baptist, Abraham, they're all the same, really. And also, God does not come close like this. God comes in the cloud to speak, just like he did at Sinai. He eats with Abraham. He walks in the Garden of Eden. God doesn't come close in Islam. And there is no suffering Messiah in Islam. Jesus is called the Messiah in the Quran, but he doesn't suffer on his way to an exodus, his rescue mission. And he's not the divine son, and so he cannot speak better words than any prophet. So Islam leaves us with a different Jesus and cuts out the heart of the gospel, which I think means there is an emphasis on this law, on doing the 5 pillars, and on a non-relational Allah. If you look at those 6 beliefs, there's not much about God there. When you do ask people about God, often it will tell you attributes about him rather than a relationship with him. In some way, could Islam be a human development of Moses for Arab people rather than for Jewish Hebrew speakers? And then here's something that might help you or not, because clearly some things about Islam seem pretty similar and some things pretty wrong. This is my summary of what I think Islam is, which feel free to challenge in some way. So Islam, I think, is a conscious and unconscious twisting and suppressing of divine revelation by Muhammad. He knew something about Jesus and God, but like Romans 1 tells us, he suppressed it, he twisted it, and those who came after him. And within the context of intra-Christian debates about Christology, around the time of Muhammad, there's lots of discussions as to who Jesus is. Is he fully divine? Is he fully human? How do those things fit together? And the Quran, I think, adds to that debate. And then inter-religious debates between Christians and Jews about Muhammad and Moses and the law. All as power was sought, identities were formed, and an empire needs to be ruled. I think that's what's going on in the first centuries of Islam. And so sometimes Islam and our Muslim friends look a bit right. Sometimes it looks a bit like a Christian heresy. Sometimes it looks a bit like Arabized Judaism. And sometimes it looks a bit paganism. I think that's my best summary where I've got to, putting it all together. We've got a few minutes before we have a break. Has anyone got any questions on what we've looked at so far before we have a break? If not, we can have a break. Yeah. There's a microphone coming.
To the screen.
When you said about the 6 beliefs earlier, the 4th was Allah's revealed books, which I think you kind of flew over it, but which ones are included in that, the revealed books? Because it says 4, but I don't know which, in relation to Christian literature more.
So some big prophets are said to have received books, of which only those are the ones that are remaining. So Abraham was thought to have received a book, but it's no longer been preserved. But those are the ones that are said to have been preserved. So that the Torah or law to Moses, the Zabur or Psalms to David, the Injil to Jesus, and the Quran to Muhammad. So those are the only 4 that are in existence. What Muslim people think is, in the same way that the Quran was given to Muhammad, so via the angel Gabriel who spoke it to him, and Muhammad then spoke it to others, that must be how these other books were revealed as well. And so then when they read the Torah or read the New Testament and realize it's not quite the same thing, that can cause a disjunction. Maybe this isn't the right book they've got. So in theory, accept all 3 extra books of Torah, Zabur, and Injil, but whether in practice they don't. Most Muslim people I've talked to would say we don't need them because the Quran supersedes them. So even if they are God's word, I've got everything I need in the Quran now. Yeah. Right. Page 5 of the handout. Some kind of practical ideas, really. building on what we've seen a little bit earlier. Before we get there, just some perceptions and misconceptions that I think are just quite helpful to get out there, which you may have come across some of these things already. Norman Anderson, the great Christian writer of the 20th century, he said this: "Let us summarize the inadequacy of the religion of Islam. First, Islam is lacking in any adequate standards of ethical or moral living. The life of the Prophet, when placed beside that of Christ, speaks for itself. Secondly, the religion of Muhammad provides no adequate or satisfying idea of the character of God. Thirdly, the Muslim knows nothing of redemption. Lastly, the Muslim knows nothing of a sanctifying power. The Muslim, for all his proud boast of a later revelation, wanders sadly in the darkness." Whilst I might not put it like that, I think I agree with everything he is saying there. It's interesting when he says about no adequate or satisfying idea of the character of God. When we've had meetings with Muslim people, we call them meetings for better understanding, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, on who is God. Tell me about the God of Islam, and I'll tell you about the God of the Bible. And often the talk is actually about what Islam is, how you're a good Muslim, rather than on who God is, which is interesting. But even though kind of I think Norman Anderson there is broadly right, there's been very little missionary activity, very little evangelism amongst Muslim people in this country and across the Islamic world in the last 1400 years, really, and very little fruit. And I think part of the reason is from the next quote by a more modern person, Timothy Tennant, an American. "Missionaries who've worked in shame-based cultures frequently observe the reason most Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists resist becoming Christians is not primarily because of specific theological objections to the Christian message. Although, as we've seen, I think Muslim people do have objections. More often, there are powerful social and cultural forces that serve as the primary barrier to Christian conversion. People in a shame-based culture are more acutely aware of the surrounding opinions of the group and are constrained from taking individual action in isolation from the larger group. Our frame of reference is apologetically focused on convincing individual Muslims of the truth of Christianity. However, the major barrier is actually not theological or doctrinal, but social, cultural, and relational. And this larger issue is often ignored completely." Now, there's a danger with reading that. You think, I don't need to talk to them about Jesus, I just need to be loving. And that's not entirely the case either. But he's got a really important point here, that often issues of identity and group and community trump truth claims in a way. It's more important that I'm part of this group than anything else. But it also means that we do have a great group we could invite people to. We have the church, which should be a loving community that's generous, hospitable, welcoming, and gives people an identity and a purpose as they follow Jesus. So just as we're doing a lot of this, think how can we not just do evangelism on my own, but how can I do it with others, and so help Muslim people to see there is a group they could join and could identify with. This next table is a little bit old, but I think it's still worth looking at. It's kind of comparing a missionary with an imam or a Muslim priest, and it mentions things like a tape recorder, which I definitely think don't exist anymore. But as a general comparison, I think is still quite helpful, because I hear things like this still today in Tower Hamlets. And it's missionary, not kind of pastor, teacher, vicar, but I think there are similarities here. So just the third one down, an imam, a Muslim priest, is people-oriented, whereas a Christian priest, missionary, is perceived as very task-oriented. Often, imam is financially poor, whereas a Christian teacher is often regarded as wealthy. He might do the wrong kind of things, according to a Muslim, by going to the theatre, watching TV, or going to movies. eating in expensive restaurants, and will probably eat pork, which is seen as a no-no. What he wears won't be perceived as modest or holy or religious. I think more of us have beards now due to lockdown, but often a lack of a beard can be a hindrance to someone taking you seriously as a Christian. And what your wife does or doesn't do, again, can hinder things in people's minds. Just the bottom of page 5 there. In terms of ministry, just the top one, the mosque is the focus of life, and the imam will pray publicly 5 times a day. What does the vicar do? Well, he goes to church a few hours a week, rarely prays in public, and it's just Sunday. And it's really interesting how often I hear it from Muslim people in Tower Hamlets, where there are lots of churches, would say, you Christians are only Christian on a Sunday for an hour and a half, whereas we Muslims 5 times every day. And I just think it's helpful to think about how people think about us and to know those things, and then we can hopefully dispel some of those misconceptions. On a similar kind of theme of misconceptions, here's a sad and true story, just the bottom of page 6. It's from 20 years ago, but it is still true, sadly. Mohammed, I've changed his name, is a 32-year-old South Asian background, British-born city worker. He's brought up as a liberal Muslim. He's seen domestic violence in his family. He had a liberal Christian friend from his school days who gave him a Bible, and he enjoyed reading it as a book of history. In 2001, after having a political argument with his Muslim friends, and as a reaction to 9/11, Muhammad left Islam and declared himself to be a Christian. Since his conversion, he's been trying to make new friends in his church, but most of the time he's disappointed by his Christian friends. His old school friend has now moved to Australia. Muhammad has been a member of the Smiths, again name changed, home group for 3 years. He's always enjoyed being with the home group, except once he had a little argument with a lady in the group. The argument was about a spiritual issue. Though he was in the wrong, he was, and still is, angry with the lady. Sometime later, the Smiths asked him if he'd like to go to Oxford with them for a long weekend. He promised to go with them, but at the last minute decided not to turn up. In summer 2006, feeling unloved, insulted, and disappointed, Muhammad decided not to see any of his Christian friends again, saying, "I'm fed up with these so-called Christian friends. The time has come for me to look for new friends." Muhammad is still living with his family. Turn to your neighbour and look at those 4 questions at the top of page 7. Don't think too hard, because some of the answers you will not get. So if you can't think of an answer, don't worry. Just spend 3 or 4 minutes looking at those questions, do you think? And then we will go through those. Yeah, 3 or 4 minutes looking at those questions based on Muhammad. You got a few seconds more. Okay. So, trying to read between the lines and with not much information, what do you think were some of the contributory factors to Muhammad saying he was a Christian? You want to shout out? Yeah, he'd seen bad things and didn't like that. Yeah. Thank you. Anything else? He'd read some of the Bible. Yep, absolutely. That was something that was important to him. Yeah, exactly. So he'd seen violence in his home. He then saw violence on the screen and had discussions with people that thought violence was good. So he's kind of feeling, I don't have anywhere anymore, and had read something of the Bible. That's right. Thank you. Why didn't Muhammad go to Oxford as he promised, do you think? Any random ideas? Yeah. Is mask coming off?
He might have felt that he'd been shamed in the group.
Yeah, he was still so upset with the lady that relationship was just breached completely. How could I be with her at all? Even though kind of she'd thought it had been dealt with. Also, and we found out later, he had a perception that even though Christians talk about morality and are good, these are white Western Christians, and we know that white Westerners are immoral. Why would they want me to go away to a weekend somewhere, just me and them? There must be some kind of immorality going to go on. Even though he'd known these people for a long time. But yeah, it's the perceptions of what Westerners do. This is something dodgy is going to happen. Why did Muhammad feel unloved, insulted, and disappointed? I think there are a few reasons. Any guesses?
We talk about different things, like it could be that he felt insulted because a lady disagreed with him, coming from a culture where man has a higher standing normally.
Yep.
Also, maybe he was still living with his family, so it doesn't read like his family was never included. So coming from a background where families they high value and you see yourself as part of a group. So it's this group and this group, and this group never seems to care about that part of your life.
Yeah.
That group like could be
Yeah. I think that's right. And he clearly values friendship, whether he does it well or not, and never felt he's got good friends. And also, something that's not here at all, but was in the back of his mind, and we found out later, we hadn't got him a wife. If the church is his family, as we say we are, household of God, we are family, brothers and sisters, what does a family do for a single guy? It helps him to find a wife. The fact that we hadn't helped to find him a wife showed we cannot be loving. In his mind, love meant finding him a wife. So whatever else we did that seemed to be loving was never enough until we'd found him a wife, because that was the loving family thing to do. Now, we can talk about the rights and wrongs of finding wives for people or husbands for people, but it's something that we might need to think about. So how might Muhammad and others like him be better helped by the church, do you think? Any thoughts? Yes? Yep. Yeah, understanding where he's come from. Yes, thank you. Mark?
A couple of times you said you found out later that, which I guess seems what you're saying. So how do we find out? Loads by asking and listening and really taking time to get to understand the culture and how things are being read and misread.
Yep.
Certainly by asking and listening.
Yeah, and recognizing that even when you ask, you might not get a proper answer back because they might be embarrassed or not want or so cross with you. But I think I can remember when we were doing marriage preparation, my wife and I, and we had an expectations worksheet, kind of 30 different questions. What do you expect from one another, and how you bring up your children, all kinds of things. It was just to provide a discussion. Even where you disagree, that wasn't the problem. It's to discuss these things. And it just made me think that actually, for someone like Muhammad and others, what are you expecting? Because often they expect exactly what the New Testament says, this loving community. And don't always see the bad things the New Testament says about the church in Corinth, for example. And it's helping people to see that we are still sinful. We will love you as best we can, but please help us to do that. And I think making it explicit over and over again, and we will get things wrong, and you will get things wrong too, and you will upset us. It's interesting, Muhammad never thought he upset us in any way, but he did. But it's talking about these things as best you can, and practically showing love as best you can. I think too, we're seeing it in Tower Hamlets, reaching an established Muslim community is different from reaching people who are newly arrived. In some ways, I think churches missed the boat in Tower Hamlets 40 years ago. I think there were some keen people, but whole churches weren't welcoming the Sylheti people. I think churches are very good at reaching asylum seekers and showing love for them, and I think they've got a lot of push factors that are driving them away from Islam. The communities here have fewer push factors because certainly in Tower Hamlets, 80,000 people, it's a big community. They look outside and they see the nasty, immoral West, and we are better than them. Why would I ever want to leave my community? Whereas an asylum seeker or refugee, they've left in some sense and they're looking for something more, and often the church provides that for them in a way they weren't ever expecting because they've been told that Christians are bad. Well, Christians are welcoming, which is wonderful. I think too that certainly second and third generation Sylheti Muslims in Tower Hamlets, some of them become more Islamic. Islam becomes their identity. They're no longer Bangladeshi Sylheti or British. They don't feel part of their parents' culture or British culture, and Islam becomes a stronger thing. Or it gets dropped completely as they get into westernized culture, whether it's music, drugs, or anything else. And some just carry on as normal. So there's differences between people. One generation that I hadn't spent much time thinking about is what they've called themselves Generation 1.5. So they came when they were 4 or 5 years old. So kind of brought up in Sylhet, but came here, educated here. And for many of them, they've had to make a decision about what kind of Islam they want to follow, which is interesting. Are they going to follow their parents' brand Are they going to follow the brand on Saudi TV that is piped into their homes at times, which their parents can't understand, or something else? And some of these guys talk about being born-again Muslims. It's really interesting that they've made conscious decisions to be this particular kind of Muslim. Whereas in Bangladesh, everyone is Muslim because that's how you've grown up. That is just your culture. So again, just important to find out people's backgrounds and where they're coming from. And often the kind of Muslim they have been might influence the kind of Christian they might be. So we've often seen quite nominal Muslim people become quite nominal Christian people, which is really infuriating. Just some thoughts on that. But kind of moving on from those and thinking about identity and gathering people together, we need to help people to see they are genuinely welcomed. And it's great that the testimony of our brother at the back, that he felt welcomed by the church, and that broke down so many barriers. We want to welcome people as best we can. In some ways, though, people feel kind of a bit like a missionary kid. So I bring my family, and we work in Bangladesh for 30 years. My children grew up there. They're not British, they're not Bangladeshi, they're kind of a third kind of ethnicity or nationality, a third kind of hybrid type. And some Muslim background believers feel like that. No longer part of their Muslim culture, not quite part of the Christian culture, somewhere in between. And I think we need to help them to realize that's natural and normal, and to help them through it. Because it's a hard thing. There are issues of identity that we need to talk about with people. Who are you? How do you relate to your Christian group and your ethnic and previous religious group? And how do you relate to the world? Just to talk about these things with people. There's one course that Interserve Mission Agency and others have put together called Joining the Family, which I think is very helpful. All about learning how to welcome people who are different, how to introduce them to your circle of friends, inviting them into your home, not treating them as trophies. We can often rejoice too much that someone from a different background, particularly a Muslim background, has become a believer, that we'll put them on the stage, we'll have their testimony, that kind of thing. And it's great, and it's really encouraging, but we mustn't treat them as trophies. And must be careful about confidentiality, particularly if they've come from another country and seeking asylum. One lady who works, she's a Muslim background herself, a Turkish lady, very bold evangelist, does a lot of work at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, which is a scary place for the faint-hearted on a Sunday afternoon. Lots of Christian-Muslim debates there. But she also does some work in the community as well, elsewhere. And through her, people are coming to faith. She's not based in one church, but she will introduce people, new believers, to churches that she thinks would be good for them. But she doesn't let a new believer go to a church until the pastor, the leader, the vicar of the church, commits to making sure they come on a Sunday and speaking to them on a Sunday. Making sure they have a home group to go to. Making sure they have a couple, an older couple that kind of be parents for them, and making sure they have somebody that can read the Bible one-to-one with them. Now, I'm sure there are difficulties and there could be more things done. That's quite a lot, isn't it? But actually, for many people, that's not nearly enough, who are coming from a culture or a family that might be 24/7 looking out for one another. But those kind of things, I think, are just about doable for us as churches, to be as welcoming and hospitable to people, to be a group for people, to be part of. But when we think of how we might disciple somebody, there's always a danger that we can be legalistic. You must do this, do this, do this. Or the opposite, antinomian, having no law at all. You're just free in Jesus, don't worry about it. And again, depending on someone's background, they might become like that as a Christian. So someone that's been very rigorous as a Muslim might become very rigorous and legalistic as a Christian. Or similarly, someone that hasn't really bothered much about their religion might similarly do that as a Christian. But just like we disciple anyone on key topics, so we need to do that for Muslim people. But here are some ways that we could do it in a way that kind of fits where they're coming from. Not least because for many Muslim people, they can feel all at sea. That the hadith and various other writings by Muslim scholars gives you detailed prescriptions of what you should do in certain situations, of what you should pray in certain situations, of how you should dress. The fact that you should put your right foot in your right shoe first and walk into a house right-footed first. You should have your beard of a certain length. When you go to the toilet, you should pray this particular prayer. Our book doesn't have much of that kind of stuff in it. And so new believers can feel all at sea, how are they to behave? And you don't want them to kind of have a whole lot of laws, but nor, do you say it doesn't matter. Because things do matter how we do things. So this is an approach that some guys in the States, he's an Egyptian by background, put together, just kind of replacing Muslim concepts with Christian ones, categories that they could understand. Look, you used to believe this, you used to do this, but now you do this or believe that. All again based on grace. And you've got some references there of different things that might be helpful for a new believer. Just the top there, prayer. Obviously we pray in a different way. We don't have to be in a mosque and do it 5 times in a set way with prostration and bowing and kneeling. But just helping someone to say, you can kneel, or you can stand, or you can lie down. It doesn't matter how you do it, but you can do all of those things. It's just really helpful to see. One friend of mine, Omar, he's currently seeking asylum. He's got his tribunal on Friday, and he struggles to pray. I genuinely think he's a believer. He's had real issues, as many asylum seekers have. But I've got confidence in him more than others that I've met, that he's a genuine follower of Jesus. But he still struggles to pray. He cannot pray out loud. We had a little Zoom meeting this week with him and a few others that are going to be his kind of witnesses in the tribunal. And someone asked him, how is it praying? And he said, I can pray in my heart. He just finds it so hard because he hasn't been given the set words to pray beyond the Lord's Prayer. Whereas he's grown up knowing exactly what to pray, how to stand, how to use his hands, he really struggles. Does that mean he's not a believer? No, I don't think it does, and hopefully I'll talk to the tribunal about his struggles in prayer. But we need to help him to be able to pray at all times continually in a way that best fits him and his character. That's just something. So lots of lists of kind of Islamic categories and how you could replace them with Christian things there. Just at the bottom of the page there, Tim Green, who's helped put together the course Come Follow Me, has put together a discipleship guide. He put together the Join the Family course. He's put together this Come Follow Me discipleship guide, really. It's about 20 different lessons, for want of a better phrase, looking at things that we might all include in any discipleship that we want to do with anybody, how to read the Bible, how to pray, but also including things that we might not ordinarily think about. And what does it mean to be a member of Christ Church along with being a member of your community? How can you still be a Seleti person and a Christian? It's kind of along there. And then really looking at persecution, why people get persecuted and how you deal with it. Husbands and wives issues. Obviously, those are issues in every culture and every community, but often there are particular things that you might need to address in terms of husband and wife culture. In Bangladesh, in the past, missionaries thought that men are heads of households. And that's true. If you reach the head of household, you'll reach the whole household, and you'll see households turning to Christ, like in Acts. And so the late 80s through to the mid-90s, most of the efforts were done towards men. Loads of men were reached. Lots of men started following Jesus. But their wives didn't, nor did their children. Because within society, within that culture, husbands and wives lead very separate lives. Husbands generally and dads aren't in the home much. They're much more outside. There's not usually the romantic love between a husband and wife, and so they wouldn't spend much time together. And that then hindered kind of this, what seemed to be a sensible approach to reach a whole culture, reach the men, you reach everybody. It didn't work. And so now women are being reached and families are being reached together. But that might be going on in the background of a bloke that comes to faith in your church. Are you talking to your wife about any of these things? Now, sometimes it's difficult to do, absolutely. If there's the danger of persecution and that kind of thing. But we do need to talk about these things with them. Disputes, certainly in Bangladeshi culture, are very, very common. People react very quickly because of the shame and honor thing when they are dishonored. And so disputes, reconciliation, forgiveness needs to be worked at. Fasting and giving. We probably don't teach that much about it, but we need to help our believers from a Muslim background to understand what it is to fast or not to fast, and what it is to give and what that means. And fate and magic. Now, part of that guide is kind of based on 1 Peter. But personally, I think reading through 1 Peter with a new believer alongside the guide is just a helpful approach. Not least because you're getting someone into the text of Scripture, not just the study guide, as helpful as it is. I think, too, that Tim Grimm and others have said that we need to show that we're willing to suffer with new believers, to show that we will suffer, not clearly as much as they might do, but be willing to do so, to show that we believe these things too. I'll stop there for a few minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions before moving on. Any questions? Yeah. Suffering with. I think it's a lot about time. So it is spending time with people when they are going through hard times themselves, rather than just the 5 minutes after the church service. I think that's part of it. I think it is being known for being a Christian, and so probably receiving abuse as well. A couple of times where we've been kind of publicly named and shamed for what we've been doing. And I think that helps the Muslim background believer to say, actually, they're going through the same thing as well. It's not about who I am, but it's about Jesus that's doing this. And I think, it's not about a color of skin thing or an ethnicity or a class. It's about Jesus, which I think is really helpful, that we're not immune from this. I think it's those two things, really. Yeah.
Just back to something before on pages 5 and 6 of this. When there was this list about Muslim priests and Christian missionaries. I come from Germany, and there's a strong Turkish population and lots of mosques and stuff as well. But there was a huge outcry recently when the German television did something like this and said about Muslim priests, because I don't know, one of the Sunni or Shia apparently don't have priests, they don't have any religious leaders that are in any way comparable to the priests in our. Is that right? And
Yeah.
what's the
So I've copied that word for word, so I wouldn't be accused of getting it wrong. But I don't think the word priest is very helpful in this instance. So often, just kind of take a step back because I think it's helpful, many Muslim people would say, we're not like you Christians, we've got direct access to God, whereas you have to go through a priest, which no, we don't. And actually, we have the high priest who gets us complete access. So it can be a theological discussion anyway. But in most mosques have somebody that leads them in some way. Now, that leader might just lead the prayers. So would call people to pray. If it's a small mosque, would stand at the front, would be the first person and everybody follows them. Or might be that same person or somebody different who would give the Friday sermon. Those functionally look like a leader that you could call a priest if you are using kind of Western religious language. But they wouldn't see it as someone that you have to have in order to get you closer to God. So I think that's kind of the distinction. Within Shia Islam, imams, the leaders, become very important. They almost do become mediators. So actually take much more of a priest-like category. But most mosques do have leaders of some kind. And I think maybe priest might not be the most helpful word to use, and it's not always the most helpful in Christian circles either because of the baggage. But there are usually people who are considered to be leaders within a mosque. And I'll come on to it, but I think Christian ministers, Christian leaders, have a great opportunity to get to know Muslim leaders, kind of as equals, and then go from there. Yeah. Anything else? Well, let's move on to some of those practical ways. So we've kind of thought a little bit about discipleship, a little bit about kind of gathering, but what about kind of earlier stages? How might you reach people? How might you make contact, other than just with neighbors and saying hello? Well, these are just different things that people have used here and around the world, really. And Bible correspondence schools. People have put out adverts in newspapers back in the day. Would you like to find out about the prophets? Right off to this address. And they've kind of been sent something and they kind of engage in correspondence. Now, I think you can do that over email now, obviously, rather than real paper. But that's something that people have done in Tower Hamlets. A book room or a book table. Many churches would put on book tables at various times, either as part of a market or just part of a specific outreach at Easter or Christmas. I think those are good things to do. I think it shows that Christians are not scared, that we believe what we believe, and we're happy to be kind of seen in public. I'm not sure they're very effective beyond that, but I don't think that's a bad thing in itself. I think it's shown that Christians are not scared, that we do exist. We don't just hide away on a Sunday between 11 and 12, but we're there on the streets. In Bangladesh, they tried to have not just a book table, but a book room where you can invite people to discussion. There would usually be a couple of believers with various books and kind of arranged in a kind of culturally appropriate way, sit on the floor, come and discuss, come and have a cup of tea. We thought we'd try something like that in Tower Hamlets. So there's a guy from a Pakistani background who's now following Jesus. He's got a business background and also a book-selling background. We thought, well, let's put this together and see what we can do. And we've rented a bookshop. We rented a shop just off Brick Lane to try to be a place that is Christian but doesn't feel like a church, that is welcoming and hospitable, and you can talk about religious things and is open for the whole community. And we found it is useful. It is a place where people who've never been to a church are happy to come to have a cup of tea, if it's not Ramadan, happy to discuss all kind of issues of religion. We'd hoped that over time, maybe, we've got a ground floor and a basement in our shop, that maybe on a Friday, as people kind of move away from Islam, they come to us on a Friday lunchtime rather than going to the mosque, and we kind of have an underground church there that meets on a Friday. And because I don't know if it's the same here, but most people don't really connect with one another when they go to mosque. They just go, they do their prayers, they come again. No one would know if you've been to the mosque or not, or been to our basement. Now, that hasn't happened, sadly, but we keep reading the Bible one-to-one with people, or in slightly larger but still small groups, hoping that something would come from that. They've done something like this in Manchester. I think it's called the Alexandria Lighthouse, something like that, on the Curry Mile. And again, it's a public face of Christianity and a space that's safe enough for people to come and find out more. I'm sure you run in pre-COVID times kind of Bible clubs, holiday clubs for children. I think that's a really effective way. Again, in Tower Hamlets, different churches have done that and got a good reputation to look after children well in the summer and teach them important religious things. Relations with schools, I think, are really important too. There is scope within the RE curriculum. There is scope certainly within Church of England schools for assemblies, collective worship, for real Christian truth to be taught. One thing that I think is kind of Christian leaders can do is get to know the imam and then think about how you might put on a church and mosque event, which is the next thing here. And this comes from a guy called Bruce McDowell and Anis Zaka, who's an Egyptian man in Philadelphia now. And he started putting on these meetings with a local mosque, looking at issues that each faith can talk about from their own perspective, and everyone can listen to without just kind of arguing and debating, but aren't an interfaith hug where you all agree at the end, because clearly we don't agree on some things. And these are some of the issues that Anis Zaka suggests. And we've done some of these with different mosques and Muslim groups. So who is God from your perspective? Who is Jesus? What is the Bible? What is the Quran? And what's been really interesting about them is it's helped Christians in their evangelism, because often a Muslim will not want to come to a church because they'll feel got at if it's just a Christian speaking. But if I'm sharing the stage with an imam, they don't feel so got at. They feel treated as an equal and be willing to come. What's also been interesting is for 20 minutes or so, I've had something of the gospel to proclaim, which has been great, and they've heard something they've probably never heard before, and that's gone past some of their misconceptions, and the questions that then result have been on the topic, not on standard kind of objections, which is, again, really encouraging. People are finding out more. I think they are worth trying to do. I think confidence has to be built between the two groups, and particularly between the leaders, that it's not going to turn into a debate, it's not going to turn into a fight, and it needs to be quite well managed initially, certainly, so that people have confidence that no one's going to grab a microphone and shout off. But we've seen these develop over time. I think, too, in the past, it fitted with a number of mosques' agenda, too, to show that they were integrated and into community cohesion and that kind of thing. Maybe that could be something that could be done here. There's a whole list of things, both kind of theological and more social. Because, again, most Muslim people think that we don't do anything with our religion apart from on a Sunday for 1 hour. So if we can say, actually, it impacts every area of our life, that's a good thing to talk about as well. One group of guys that we finally got a Zoom group going with, 5 Muslims and 5 Christians, they were getting a bit bored with our comparing the Bible and the Quran on different prophets, and they wanted it to be more issue-based. And so we had something on family life on Sunday night. What does it mean to bring up children as a Christian or as a Muslim in a secular culture? And it was interesting in itself, hearing their struggles and challenges. And you hope that you've given something of the gospel too, by saying what is the basis for family, what is the basis for marriage, Christ and the church, the importance of grace and forgiveness in those things. On to the next page, page 10, counselling. You can ask a question from the YouTube stream. So the second question is easier. The events, we've always tried to do them for men and for women. When we've had them in a mosque, there have been 2 things that have happened. Either no women have been invited, which is very frustrating, or there's been a separate hall for the women, and it's kind of been on a screen. Occasionally, the hall we've been speaking in has been divided into with men on one side, women on the other. When we've held it in a church, we have not explicitly divided men and women, because I don't think, within my culture of church, I don't think that's the thing you should necessarily do. I think there are good reasons for doing it other places, but I don't think you have to do it. Other people take a different view. But so we just wanted, we knew people who would bring people and said, if you're a bloke, try and sit with the blokes. If you're a woman, try and sit with other women, and try and just be respectful. But we didn't want to have kind of set seating in that way. But it was different in the mosque. But we want to include as many people as possible and to be appropriate for all. And we have found that women have come to those. More generally, is it different reaching men to women? Yes and no. Certainly in Tower Hamlets, men are more public, women are more private. Not in terms of what they say, but where they are. Men are more outside of the home, and women are more inside the home. That's not exclusively the case, because lots of women in Tower Hamlets who are sletty do work. But generally their sphere of influence is in the home, whereas the men is outside. And that's partly why we got the bookshop going, was to reach men in the Brick Lane area who would be working there. They could come to the shop. So in that sense, then often it seems to be the case that practically women are often better reached by visiting their homes, whereas men are practically better reached by doing stuff outside the home, whether it's visiting their business or playing football. Despite my aged limbs, I play a lot more football than I used to, just to meet some blokes who are equally slow like me. In terms of kind of conversations and objections and what people think of the Bible and the Quran, both my wife and I haven't found much difference between men and women. Some have been nominal, some have been conservative, some have been fundamentalist. Most have had the same kind of objections, whatever their background and whether men or women. I think the stories that you might share about Jesus, which I'll come on to, you might want to pick more stories where Jesus relates to women, to show how his love and his concern and his mercy and his compassion and his care for women is different from other religious teachers. But equally, I think that's good for men to hear as well. And to compare John 3 and Nicodemus with the Samaritan woman in John 4, for example, I think are helpful for everybody to hear. The difficulty with, we found that when I've got to know a bloke, or when my wife has got to know a woman, it's been very hard for us to get to know the spouse. So my wife will say to the wife, "Oh, why don't you invite us over, or we'll invite you over?" And the wife will talk to the husband, and the husband will say, "Why do I want to know your friend's husband? What's that?" It just doesn't seem to be a thing in it. Now, that might just be Saletti people, but that's what we found. That it's quite hard to get to know a whole family if the kind of friendship has begun with only one partner. That's where I think schools can be really good. Primary schools, if both mums and dads do the school run, you can get to know their mums and dads too, which I think is really helpful. And we've seen that quite a lot, actually. That's been helpful. Generally, women should reach women and men should reach men because of misunderstandings as to Westerners and Christians are all immoral. So I'd say that too. We've seen women's groups go better than men's groups. I don't know quite why that is the case, whether it's the women were friends beforehand or just friendlier. I don't know. But when visiting, I think it's really important not to go on your own, not for kind of security purposes, but so they see more Christians. So take a friend, take someone else, so they can see something of Christians loving one another, and they don't just know one Christian. Some things. Hopefully that's answered on YouTube a little bit, but come back if I haven't. Counselling, lots of churches do provide counselling services generally, and I think it can be helpful particularly for Muslim people. There's often, certainly people that we know are very hesitant to talk about their problems within the community, but are more able to talk about their problems with us because they don't think we're going to gossip about them. And counselling, a service provided by a church, can be a good way of helping people that have real difficulties to speak about them, but also to show them love as well. And public debates can be good sometimes. I think you've got to be very good at them to do them well. Friendships, hospitality, the kind of things we're talking about, and family evangelism. So having your whole family in all your irritable teenagerness in your home and your toddler tantrumness, but doing family evangelism together I think is great. So they begin to see the whole family trying to follow Jesus. And your children can have conversations about religion. It's really interesting just with our children. I don't think they are model evangelists by any stretch, but they've just grown up in a very religious atmosphere in Tower Hamlets. It's a Christian home and lots of Muslim friends, and they're very able to talk about things and not scared to do so. Very unlike me, which is lovely to see. House churches. So Anis Saka, who put together some of these things, he set up this organization called Church Without Walls. He thought churches have too many walls that keep people out, and homes can be a place where people feel fewer barriers to coming to faith. I think there's something in that. I think house churches can be a warm and welcoming place more than a building, but I think house churches can also be quite weird. We've been thinking this through in Tower Hamlets. I think people are more suspicious at the moment of coming into your home for a church-like thing rather than the public meeting, because of what goes on in the media about abuse, I think. Why would you want to meet in a home? There must be something wrong. You must be trying to do something. Let's do it more publicly. And so I'd always thought that house church would be a better model for reaching Saletti people in Tower Hamlets. I'm not as convinced as I used to be about that. And we've got this monthly meeting that's in a very public space at the moment. International dinners and poetry evenings, not something I'm necessarily keen on, poetry, but lots of cultures are. So some London City missioners have put on Urdu poetry evenings, and they've become widely known across London. And it's just a way of getting to know people, getting to meet people, maybe a different kind of Muslim person, because often poetry and song is looked down upon. But you can have Christian poetry as part of that as well. Saletti culture, Bangladeshi culture, is often quite colourful, and going to their cultural evenings can help you to think what kind of evenings you could put on. Mail shots, use of media, including social media. We've just started, obviously going to put tracts through people's doors, invite to Christmas and Easter events, that kind of thing. It's often a lot of work without much return, but people do come to things every so often. And I think we found people come in COVID times because they're bored, which is a good thing. But we've also seen that social media can be a good way of reaching people. If you have a Facebook business account, you can then, plague's the wrong word, but plague people on their Facebook feeds with all kinds of things, but hopefully good Christian things. So using the magic Facebook algorithm, we can send out a video of a minute or 2 minutes to 80,000 Bangladeshi people in Tower Hamlets and Newham, and it will go onto their feed. And it's amazing the number of people that have clicked on a Christian video that's in Saletti. We haven't seen many kind of comments or contacting us through it, but lots of people have seen lots of Christian content. It's amazing. Prison visiting, asylum seekers, refugees, talked a little bit about that already, door to door. English teaching, I think, as long as there are new arrivals in this country, English teaching will always be needed, but you're only going to reach the new arrivals. I don't think you're going to reach people who are more settled and more established unless they've never learned English, which we do see still a little bit of, particularly amongst the wives, sadly, of Saletti people. So those are kind of practical things, the different things that you could be involved in as Christians and as churches. But what about actually getting into the Bible itself? So someone's come to your church through one of these things, they've shown an interest. How might you kind of get to the Bible with them? Well, one way is just kind of telling Bible stories, helping people to see who Jesus is from a parable or from, that reminds me of a time when Jesus ... Like I said about the coriander demons, just sharing something of what Jesus did. And would you like to find out more? Well, let's open up the Bible together. Often, I will try and begin at the beginning, which sounds fairly obvious. But I think one of the reasons that Muslim people don't understand Christianity and how great we think Jesus is because we begin with Jesus, which is what we want to do, obviously. But they don't know the background. They don't know why Jesus had to come and why he's so great. What's one of the reasons why the disciples are fearful on Easter Sunday is because they haven't understood the law and the prophets that Jesus goes to that says, shows you why I had to suffer and die and rise again. they haven't got the first part of the story. So they didn't get the middle part, the climax. And I think with some Muslim people, we need to do that too, to begin at the beginning, to begin in Genesis, to show that our Creator is slightly different from your Creator. He's a relational God that is concerned for people. And talk about these kinds of things. In some ways, beginning in the Old Testament also gets underneath the radar a bit. Many Muslim people have got an apologetic against the Gospels. Oh, those definitely been changed. But if you look at the Old Testament, it can feel a bit familiar. It can feel a bit similar. It talks about God, Creator, Adam and Eve, Abraham, categories and people that often they know quite a lot about. Sometimes we've found people have been hesitant to look at the Bible at all, and so I've said, okay, well, why don't we look at the Bible and the Quran at the same time? I'll tell you about Adam and Eve in the Bible, you tell me about Adam and Eve in the Quran. Cain and Abel, Noah, and go through a kind of a chronological storying of the prophets, as Muslim people consider them, but always kind of giving the Bible story of how there is a promise that is going to be fulfilled in the Messiah. And we're doing that with some guys on Zoom at the moment. Or just read a gospel. If someone is just interested, just open up a gospel, whichever gospel you are happiest with. Matthew is good, as it begins with Jesus being a descendant of Abraham and David, linking him into that Old Testament narrative, showing he's part of the prophetic family. Luke can be good. Those first couple of chapters of Luke sound familiar to some stories in the Quran. The Quran has Jesus' virgin birth, it has John the Baptist being born, so it can kind of feel a bit familiar. But whatever gospel you're most familiar with, go for it. Because every gospel has problems for Muslim people. Mark 1:1, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Straight up front, Son of God. But that comes through in Matthew as well. John, the word being divine, being Jesus, that's problematic, but you've got to deal with it at some point. So whichever gospel you feel most comfortable with, I think be willing to share with somebody. Or you could be more topical. I don't particularly like this approach, but others do. Beginning with kind of an introduction to the Bible, the Torah, the Zabur, the Injil. One book that's recently come out, whose title I now forget, and the author's name I've got lost as well. Let me remind myself. It's Samuel Green is the author, and it's something like Witnessing to Muslims, a New Approach. But he says, don't underestimate the evangelistic power of the Bible's contents page. I think, what? It's really true. I'd never thought about this before. The Bible's contents page shows the Bible's content, shows it's not one book written by one man, but has multiple authors, all the prophets, whereas your book is just one book by one man. We've got them all here. So why don't you come and read all the other prophets? Very simple, very obvious, but I've never thought about it before, and it's really helpful. I think, look, this is what, and it helps me to understand what the Bible is. It's not one book, but a collection of books by these different prophets as moved by God's Spirit. And there's some different topics that you can look at there. So Allah's condescension, the fact that he is accommodating himself. He's gracious and compassionate from the very beginning. That's from Annie Sacker as well. Different topics that you could look at. Just on the back on page 11, thinking again about whether to do something in one-to-one or as a group. If you can get more than one person to read the Bible with you together, that is brilliant, I think. Because who knows what God may do in that group. It could become a proto-home group, a proto-church. You can begin to show what Christian discipleship looks like in a group much more easily than one-to-one. I think that can be a good thing. If you're unsure about how to read the Bible with somebody, this is just a very simple framework, I think, for doing it with one-to-one or as a group, with the idea that you're hoping someone will move to faith as you're doing it. So just begin by, what can you thank God for from this week? What's been good about your week that a bit later we can just thank God for? And what's been hard about your week that we can pray about later? Remember, what did we learn about last week? You then read the passage and say, well, how Can you retell that? Many Muslim people have much better memories than I do. They've been just schooled that way, and often can retell a passage, and you hope that's beginning to go into their head and their heart. But also the way they retell it will also help you to see how much they've picked up and what's important to them. And then, it's not a great Bible study question, but what do you like about the story? Again, it helps you to see what they've enjoyed from it, what they've got from it. And they often bring out things that they didn't like as well, which is helpful to talk about. So this is not really a structured question-answer Bible study, which we generally do in our church back home. That's quite rigorous and structured. It's more a bit free-flowing, but I think it's going with where they are, what they are picking up. Think for them then, what do you think the first hearers of this particular passage had to learn about God and people? And then the harder question, I think, for people, how does this help us understand Jesus? Now, in Genesis 3, for example, Adam and Eve's sin, what does the first hearers learn about God? Well, that he is holy, he doesn't tolerate sin, he's a judge, that people get things wrong, they're sinful, they run away from God, they're guilty, they're shameful. All those kind of things can kind of be brought out. How does this help us understand Jesus? Well, most Muslim people, most of us wouldn't necessarily know what to do until we'd been pointed out as a promise there that points to one who will come to crush Satan's head. Now, some passages are easy like that. You say, well, that's a promise that looks forward to Jesus. We're not going to go to him yet, but Jesus conquers Satan when he doesn't give in to temptation, when he drives out demons, when he dies on the cross. But that's the middle and the end of the story. Let's come back here. But I think it's important to show how Jesus comes into every passage in some way. And then responding, what should we do or pray as a result of this? And then this is an interesting one I'd never thought of before. Who can you share this story with? In Bangladesh, there's a lady there that spent 2 years just visiting a home and sharing stories. Sometimes she'd prepare beforehand, right, I want to share this parable with them. Or sometimes she'd go and just ask God to lead her. If something comes up, God, please bring a story to mind that I can share from the Bible. After about a couple of years of this, they finally said, we'd like to read your book with you and go through these stories together. And she's been kind of doing this kind of thing. And it's interesting, they are telling their neighbors about the stories that this missionary is sharing. Now, no one is a believer yet, and we mustn't think that they are when they haven't made that commitment. But it is interesting that the word is clearly doing something in their lives. And just having that, who could you tell this story to, gets people thinking, this is not something I should keep to myself. And if they do start following Jesus, imagine what an impact that could have. So there's some just, I think, fairly easy questions that you could do one-to-one or in a group. Richard Bourgonon is a guy that works in the city of London. He's an insurer. He sells things. He's a very effective seller. He's helped to write a Bible study guide on John's Gospel, how you could read it with other people, called The Word One-to-One. He's very good at selling John's Gospel to people. He says that he's for every 5 people he asks whether they'd like to read John's Gospel, 1 person says yes, which I'm staggered by. I think I'm at about 1 in 100, if that, if you're kind of looking for statistics with Muslim people. It might be far worse than that. So I don't think we necessarily should kind of go by statistics, but in my general experience, there's a big barrier for Muslim people to get over to look at the Bible. Often happy to have religious conversations, often happy to talk about Jesus, but it can be hard to actually get the Bible open with them. Which is why I think it's important to build a team so that you can have encouragements from others. If you're getting nowhere in your personal evangelism, he's doing really well at the moment with that one person. We can pray and support him. The team holds you accountable. Whilst I think every church should be welcoming of Muslim people, it's not going to be the case that every Christian, every church makes this their main ministry, and it shouldn't be. There are many other things that churches should be doing, but I think it's good if a few people make this their main thing and work as a team to support and pray for and get to know one another's Muslim contacts. Those are some practical things, and it's nearly 1 o'clock. But any questions? Happy to take them. That's fine. Mark, shall I pray? Yeah. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that you are not a distant God. Thank you that not only did you make us, but you have made yourself known to us in your Son. Thank you that he did come to earth. Thank you he revealed what you are like. Thank you that he showed mercy and compassion and love in reality, not simply as concepts and words, attributes. Thank you that we've experienced that kindness and generosity and grace from you through your Son. Thank you that he did truly die and truly rise again. Thank you that your Spirit in our hearts and has given us new birth, has taken away our sin, has given us a new inheritance that is sure and certain. And we know, Lord, these things are things which anyone outside of Christ does not have, does not enjoy. And that's true for many, many Muslim people around us here in this town and elsewhere. Father, please help us to know the wonders of what you have given us and be able to share them. Please give us boldness. Please help us in our churches to have others that we can work alongside to be bold in outreach. Please help our churches to be welcoming, generous, hospitable places to all kinds of people, but particularly Muslim people. And Father, we do earnestly pray that you would be bringing people into your kingdom, giving us something of the foretaste of that vision and revelation where the many multitudes are around your throne. Thank you, we do see something of that now. Might we see more so that your name is known and that people do praise your name for all eternity. In Jesus' name, amen.
Rob, can I thank you so much for coming to be with us today. A very helpful combination, I think, of principles and practical applications for us, and delivered very graciously. The North West Gospel Partnership exists because as local churches we're partnering together. We want to reach the North West with the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, and there are many, many Muslims in our region who need to hear about Jesus, and an event such as today is really helpful to remind us again. Many of you living, working, ministering amongst Muslims, but we want to see that grow, that kind of ministry amongst the partnership. And today has been so helpful contribution to that. So thank you very much for that.